So I took a job as a saleswoman in a large department store. That did it, she said. I immediately found myself in a whirlwind of activity. Customers swarming around me asking for prices, sizes, colors, never a second to think of anything except my immediate duty. And when night came, I could think of nothing except getting off my aching feet. As soon as I ate dinner, I fell into bed and instantly became unconscious. I had neither the time nor the energy to worry. She discovered for herself what John Cowper Powys meant when he said, in The Art of Forgetting the Unpleasant, a certain comfortable security, a certain profound inner peace, a kind of happy numbness soothes the nerves of the human animal when absorbed in its allotted tasks. And what a blessing that it is so. Osa Johnson, one of the world's most famous women explorers, told me how she found release from worry and grief. You may have read the story of her life. It's called I Married Adventure. If any woman ever married adventure, she certainly did. Martin Johnson married her when she was 16 and lifted her feet off the sidewalks of Chanute, Kansas, and set them down on the wild jungle trails of Borneo. For a quarter of a century, this Kansas couple traveled all over the world, making motion pictures of the vanishing wildlife of Asia and Africa. Some years later, they were on a lecture tour showing their famous films. They took a plane out of Denver bound for the coast. The plane plunged into a mountain. Martin Johnson was killed instantly. The doctors said Osa would never leave her bed again. But they didn't know Osa Johnson. 3 months later, she was in a wheelchair, lecturing before large audiences. In fact, she addressed over 100 audiences that season, all from a wheelchair. When I asked her why she did it, she replied, "I did it so I would have no time for sorrow and worry." Osa Johnson had discovered the same truth that Tennyson had sung about a century earlier. I must lose myself in action, lest I wither in despair. Admiral Byrd discovered this same truth when he lived all alone for 5 months in a shack that was literally buried in the great glacial ice cap that covers the South Pole, an ice cap that holds nature's oldest secrets, an ice cap covering an unknown continent larger than the United States and Europe combined. Admiral Byrd spent 5 months there alone. No other living creature of any kind existed within 100 miles. The cold was so intense that he could hear his breath freeze and crystallize as the wind blew it past his ears. In his book, Alone, Admiral Byrd tells all about those 5 months he spent in bewildering and soul-shattering darkness. The days were as black as the nights. He had to keep busy to preserve his sanity. At night, he says, before blowing out the lantern, I formed the habit of blocking out the morrow's work. It was a case of assigning myself an hour, say, to the escape tunnel, half an hour to leveling drift, an hour to straightening up the fuel drums, an hour to cutting bookshelves in the walls of the food tunnel, and 2 hours to renew a broken bridge in the man-hauling sledge. It was wonderful, he says, to be able to dole out the time in this way. It brought me an extraordinary sense of command over myself. And he adds, without that, or an equivalent, the days would have been without purpose, and without purpose they would have ended, as such days always end, in disintegration. And note that last again. Without purpose, the days would have ended, as such days always end, in disintegration. If you and I are worried, let's remember that we can use good old-fashioned work as a medicine. That was said by no less an authority than the late Dr. Richard C. Cabot, formerly professor of clinical medicine at Harvard. In his book, What Men Live By, Dr. Cabot says, as a physician, I have had the happiness of seeing work cure many persons who have suffered from trembling palsy of the soul, which results from overmastering doubts, hesitations, vacillation, and fear. Courage given us by our work is like the self-reliance which Emerson has made forever glorious. If you and I don't keep busy, if we sit around and brood, we will hatch out a whole flock of what Charles Darwin used to call the wibber-jibbers. and the wibber-jibbers are nothing but old-fashioned gremlins that will run us hollow and destroy our power of action and our power of will. I know a businessman in New York who fought the wibber-jibbers by getting so busy that he had no time to fret and stew. His name is Tremper Ongman. He was a student in one of my classes, and his talk on conquering worry was so interesting, so impressive, that I asked him to have a late supper with me after class, and we sat in a restaurant until long past midnight discussing his experiences. Here's the story he told me. 18 years ago, I was so worried I had insomnia. I was tense, irritated, and jittery. I felt I was headed for a nervous breakdown. I had reason to be worried. I was treasurer of the Crown Fruit and Extract Company. We had $500,000 invested in strawberries packed in gallon tins. For 20 years, we'd been selling these gallon tins of strawberries to manufacturers of ice cream. Suddenly, our sales stopped because the big ice cream makers, such as National Dairy and Borton's, were rapidly increasing their production and were saving money and time by buying strawberries packed in barrels. Not only were we left with $500,000 of berries we couldn't sell, but we were also under contract to buy $1 million more of strawberries in the next 12 months. We had already borrowed $350,000 from the banks. We couldn't possibly pay off or renew these loans. No wonder I was worried. I rushed out to Watsonville, California, where our factory was located, and tried to persuade our president that conditions had changed, that we were facing ruin. He refused to believe it. He blamed our New York office for all the trouble, poor salesmanship. After days of pleading, I finally persuaded him to stop packing more strawberries and sell our new supply on the fresh berry market in San Francisco. That almost solved our problems. I should have been able to stop worrying then, but I couldn't. Worry is a habit, and I had that habit. When I returned to New York, I began worrying about everything. The cherries we were buying in Italy, the pineapples we were buying in Hawaii, and so on. I was tense, jittery, couldn't sleep, and as I've already said, I was heading for a nervous breakdown. In despair, I adopted a way of life that cured my insomnia and stopped my worries. I got busy. I got so busy with problems demanding all my faculties that I had no time to worry. I'd been working 7 hours a day. I now began working 15 and 16 hours a day. I got down to the office every morning at 8 o'clock and stayed there every night until almost midnight. I took on new duties, new responsibilities. When I got home at midnight, I was so exhausted when I fell in bed that I became unconscious in a few seconds. I kept up this program for about 3 months. I had broken the habit of worry by that time, so I returned to a normal working day of 7 or 8 hours. This event occurred 18 years ago. I have never been troubled with insomnia or worry since then. George Bernard Shaw was right. He summed it all up when he said, "The secret of being miserable is to have the leisure to bother about whether you are happy or not. So don't bother to think about it. Spit on your hands and get busy. Your blood will start circulating, your mind will start ticking, and pretty soon this whole positive upsurge of life in your body will drive worry from your mind. Get busy, keep busy. It's the cheapest kind of medicine there is on this earth, and one of the best. To break the worry habit, here is Rule 1. Keep busy. The worried person must lose himself in action, lest he wither in despair." Chapter 7. Don't Let the Beatles Get You Down. Here's a dramatic story that I'll probably remember as long as I live. It was told to me by Robert Moore of Maplewood, New Jersey. "I learned the biggest lesson of my life in March 1945, he said. I learned it under 276 feet of water off the coast of Indochina. I was one of 88 men aboard the submarine Baya SS-318. We had discovered by radar that a small Japanese convoy was coming our way. As daybreak approached, we submerged to attack. I saw through the periscope a Japanese destroyer escort, a tanker, and a mine layer. We fired 3 torpedoes at the destroyer escort, but missed. Something went haywire in the mechanics of each torpedo. The destroyer, not knowing that she had been attacked, continued on. We were getting ready to attack the last ship, the mine layer, when suddenly she turned and came directly at us. A Japanese plane had spotted us under 60 feet of water and had radioed our position to the Japanese mine layer. We went down to 150 feet to avoid detection and rigged for depth charge. We put extra bolts on the hatches, and in order to make our sub absolutely silent, we turned off the fans, the cooling system, and all electrical gear. 3 minutes later, all hell broke loose. 6 depth charges exploded all around us and pushed us down to the ocean floor, a depth of 276 feet. We were terrified. To be attacked in less than 1,000 feet of water is dangerous. Less than 500 is almost always fatal. And we were being attacked in a trifle more than half of 500 feet of water, just about knee-deep as far as safety was concerned. For 15 hours, that Japanese mine layer kept dropping depth charges. If a depth charge explodes within 17 feet of a sub, the concussion will blow a hole in it. Scores of these depth charges exploded within 50 feet of us. We were ordered to secure, to lie quietly in our bunks and remain calm. I was so terrified I could hardly breathe. This is death, I kept saying to myself over and over. This is death. This is death. With the fans and cooling system turned off, the air inside the sub was over 100 degrees, but I was so chilled with fear that I put on a sweater and a fur-lined jacket, and I still trembled with cold. My teeth chattered. I broke out in a cold, clammy sweat. The attack continued for 15 hours, then ceased suddenly. Apparently, the Japanese mine layer had exhausted its supply of depth charges and steamed away. Those 15 hours of attack seemed like 15 million years. All my life passed before me in review. I remembered all the bad things I had done, all the little absurd things that I had worried about. I'd been a bank clerk before I joined the Navy. I had worried about the long hours, the poor pay, the poor prospect of advancement. I had worried because I couldn't own my own home, couldn't buy a new car, couldn't buy my wife nice clothes. How I had hated my old boss, who was always nagging and scolding. I remembered how I would come home at night, sore and grouchy, and quarrel with my wife over trifles. I'd worried about a scar on my forehead, a nasty cut from an auto accident. How big all those worries seemed years ago. How absurd they seemed when depth charges were threatening to blow me to kingdom come. I promised myself then and there that if I ever saw the sun and stars again, I would never, never worry again. Never, never, never. I learned more about the art of living in those 15 terrible hours in that submarine than I had learned by studying books for 4 years in Syracuse University. We often face the major disasters of life bravely, and then let the trifles, the pains in the neck, get us down. For example, Samuel Pepys tells in his diary about seeing Sir Harry Vane's head chopped off in London. As Sir Harry mounted the platform, he was not pleading for his life, but was pleading with the executioner not to hit the painful boil on his neck. And that was another thing that Admiral Byrd discovered down in the terrible cold and darkness of the polar nights, that his men fussed more about the pains in the neck than about the big things. They bore without complaining the dangers, the hardships, and the cold that was often 80 degrees below zero. But, says Admiral Byrd, I know of bunkmates who quit speaking to each other because each suspected the other of inching his gear into the other's allotted space. And I knew of one who could not eat unless he could find a place in the mess hall out of sight of the Fletcherist who solemnly chewed his food 28 times before swallowing. In a